Hello everyone, today I'm at the Tower of London.
Ah, London, a city drenched in juicy history, full of happiness and scandals alike, a place where you could be minding your own business and happen upon the monarch. Today, I'll be talking about the Tower of London. The Tower of London is both a world famous and notorious castle situated upon the north bank of the River Thames in central London within the borough of Tower Hamlets. The White Tower was founded after 1066 by William the Conqueror, following his victory during the Norman conquest of England, that saw him assume power as the new King of England. The White Tower would be under construction from shortly after the Norman conquest to almost 2 decades later, with it seeing completion in the mid-1080s. Masons would journey all the way from France, William's homeland, with the stone from Caen. However, the labour would primarily be provided by English labourers. Though initially most Norman castles were constructed with timber in order to quickly establish control, so the castle would technically be completed only to be renovated with stone before the end of the 11th century. William intended to dominate the London skyline and also remind the local Londoners that they were under his control now. At this time, it would be resented as a symbol of oppression under England's new Norman lords. The White Tower would only get its name after the fact when King Henry III had the structure painted white in 1240. The tower would see expansion over the next 2 centuries, with Henry III and Edward I expanding the castle by adding 2 defensive curtain walls and several smaller towers. The moat surrounding what's known today as the Tower of London would also be expanded. The tower would become the largest and strongest concentric castle, meaning it was a castle with defences inside its defences. The Tower of London would serve a variety of purposes over its millennia of history, from protecting many a king and queen, including their possessions in a time of need, housing them on site in luxurious apartments, to holding high-profile prisoners, including but not exclusive to some of those very same kings and queens. In fact, the Tower of London has garnered a hefty reputation as a prison for all kinds of individuals, with over 800 years worth of history as a prison, though it would typically take somebody to be deemed a threat to national security in order to be sent here. The list of very well-known individuals held at the tower include Anne Boleyn, King Henry VIII's second wife, and also Henry's 5th wife, Catherine Howard, both of which would be beheaded, and Lady Jane Grey. Elizabeth I would be also imprisoned here for 2 months in 1554. Guy Fawkes, the demolitions expert of the foiled gunpowder plot, would also be held prisoner and interrogated here following his capture. The last people to be held prisoner at the Tower of London would be none other than the Cray twins, ruthless gangsters in London's criminal underworld during the 1960s. However, they were held at the Tower due to avoiding national service. Their stay at the Tower would only last a few days during March of 1952, before being reintegrated into the British Army. That skips over a lot of the interesting historical characters over the centuries, but if we were to go into any form of detail on all of them, we would simply be here listing names all day, and a lot of them I'd probably mispronounce. A lot of prisoners held at the Tower would face extreme interrogation. Guy Fawkes is a key example of someone who was held here and tortured in order to extract information and a confession to give up his co-conspirators in the gunpowder plot that would have blown up Parliament, including King James I and his entire family, as well as the House of Lords, which likely would have sent England into turmoil. James I admired Fawkes's grit when it came to withstanding torment. However, even his will would give out, and his confession would be signed with the handwriting of a shaky, broken man. Perhaps this is the biggest example of how brutal the interrogation process was here. Despite being a notorious prison, only 22 people were ever executed within the walls of the Tower of London, at least half of which would occur during the 20th century, as German spies would be sent here and shot by firing squads during the World Wars. It's worth noting, during the tower's earlier years of use, when prisoners were brought in, they could only be brought in at certain times of the month. This was due to the water level of the River Thames. You see, only on specific days of the month would the Thames be deep enough and the levels high enough for prisoners to be brought in via boat. Now this might seem odd, as the castle did have a land entrance, but it was seen as harder for the prisoners to escape if they arrived on water and brought directly within the tower grounds. You can still see today where the prisoners would have been brought in via boat, and you can already imagine their thought process of, oh god, there is no way out of here. See, the Tower of London was great for holding prisoners. However, when it came to executions, it was often not a fantastic venue for a public spectacle. A spot outside the tower would see over 100 public executions. Before ethics were considered, an execution was just not the ending of a convicted individual's life, but also humiliation, a reminder to the public, and perhaps moreover the lords, that stepping out of line will be met with severe consequences. But this isn't to say that it wasn't a family fun day out, as it would be the thing to do after a day's work, going watching the local criminal hang, or his head roll, whatever takes your fancy. This is not the only element of the Tower of London's bloody history. During the War of the Roses, the deposed Henry VI would be found and assumed murdered in 1471, most likely under the orders of the king at the time, Edward IV. Then there's also the story of the princes in the tower, who vanished within the castle walls in 1483, aged 12 and 9 years old. They were Edward, who would have for a short time been King Edward V between April and June of 1483, and Richard. It is unclear what happened, but Richard III assumed the throne upon Edward V's disappearance. It is unclear how the children vanished, however it is likely that they were murdered. A popular theory suggests that the boys were murdered by Richard III, however there is no viable evidence to support this hypothesis. 2 skeletons would be found at the tower almost 2 centuries later in 1674, and upon re-examination were proved to belong to a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old. It is therefore believed that these remains were that of Edward and Richard. But don't worry lads, if Richard III did kill you, his remains were found under a car park in Leicester in 2012, so it could be worse. The Chapel Royal of St. Peter, located on the site, is known as the burial site of some of the tower's most well-known prisoners, including 3 queens of England, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard and Lady Jane Grey, all of whom were executed here during the 16th century. The chapel was restored in 1876. This unearthed some remains, including those of Anne Boleyn, who would be reburied under a marble pavement inscribed with their names and coat of arms so they could be identified. The Tower of London would also hold a crucial role in the English economy between the reign of Edward I in the late 13th century and the dawn of the 19th century. In this period, all coins in England were made at the Tower Mint, and kings and queens alike would stash their valuables away here. And even today, the crown jewels are homed at the Tower and are protected by a garrison of soldiers. Though, that didn't stop me. In fact, the only individual, beside myself, who has ever attempted to steal the crown jewels was Thomas Blood, in 1671, who has garnered the reputation as one of the most audacious thieves in the history of Britain. His plan was mental, and he was apprehended, though this wouldn't see him punished. This was because the king at the time, Charles I, found his attempt to be amusing. Smoothed over with his Irish charm, Thomas Blood effectively got off scot-free. However, the jewels would be returned to their place. In fact, Blood was even gifted land in his homeland of Ireland. The tower is also home to the famous yeoman warders, initially part of the monarch's personal bodyguard, who would travel with the king or queen. Henry VIII would decree that some of these yeoman warders would stay and guard the tower indefinitely in the early 16th century, 500 years ago, and they can still be seen here, and have been given the nickname Beefeaters. They primarily guard the tower and its visitors. However, they still partake in ceremonial duties, such as the ceremony of the keys. This ceremony was performed every night, only ever being missed once during the Second World War due to the air raids. The yeoman warders can easily be identified by the iconic red state dress uniforms that they don on important occasions. Interestingly, it was perhaps the safest place to be in London during the air raids. This is because Hitler had earmarked the location as his base of operations if he was to ever invade the United Kingdom. Today, the Tower of London is a massive tourist attraction. Its identity as a World Heritage Site attracts visitors from across the globe. However, when the tower is closed, it is never empty nor dormant. The tower is home to the yeoman warders and their families, a garrison of soldiers, and the resident governor, who is responsible for the day-to-day running of the Tower of London. The Tower of London also houses a doctor and a chaplain, and even has a pub, although it appears to be exclusive to the residents. Between the 1200s and the 1800s, the tower also had a zoo, containing a plethora of exotic wild animals that were never seen before in London. These animals were imported from all across the world and included lions, tigers, zebras, elephants, alligators, kangaroos, monkeys, and a polar bear that was given as a royal gift. I'd imagine that made Thomas Blood's job a damn sight harder. The activity at the tower today can not only be attributed to the living, as there are many legends of ghosts and hauntings at the site. It's been an attraction, open to visitors since the 18th century. In the 1800s, many visitors were fascinated by the gruesome history of the nation, and thus ghost stories began to emerge. Supposedly, Anne Boleyn's ghost is said to patrol the site of her execution on Tower Green. 2 smaller ghosts have been reported and are believed to be the princes of the tower. The yeoman warders are known to tell of the story of a spectre bear that supposedly emerges occasionally to frighten visitors to death. Another legend associated with the tower regards its ravens. The tale says that if the ravens were to leave the Tower of London, both it and the kingdom will collapse. The ravens are presently kept in cages at the Tower of London due to the aviary flu. There are 9 live ravens on the site and are cared for by the one dedicated yeoman warder who has the title of Raven Master. Ultimately, the Tower of London was a fascinating sight, impressive in its power and yet not remarkably massive in what we could walk around, from fascinating stories kept within the armoury to the breathtaking White Tower's stature. Imagining how these structures could impose so much power on an entire country is something else. Then, of course, you can visit the crown jewels. Or maybe not, because I've nicked them and I'm currently using them as paperweights. Within the tower's large collection, you can also see a set of King Henry VIII's armour, and you can also see other things such as decorative guns that were handed in during an armistice in the United Kingdom. I had a jolly old time when I visited the Tower of London. Its fascinating structures, with its deep history as well within, was truly eye-opening. It is somewhere that I would visit again if I was ever in London, because it is one of those places that you could keep going back to and find out even more information on its dark and illustrious past. So that wraps up today's video. If you liked it, like it, share and subscribe. Remember to press that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of our future content. If you have a friend who is keen to learn more about history and may like our channel, but doesn't have the acclamation at the moment to do so, simply lure them to the Tower of London, tie them up within the tower with only an iPad, and if they haven't watched all our content by sunrise the following morning, then we will release the polar bear. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.